Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Board. I'm Gavin Coughlin, Agile Coach here at Boost Agile, and today we are going to be talking about a couple of controversial topics. No estimating and mob programming are the topics we'll be covering today. I am joined by these
Kirsten
two.
Donaldson.
And Paul Llewellyn.
Thanks, Gav.
No problem. So, yes, we've been talking a little bit about these topics today, particularly the no estimating thing, because obviously we've been using Scrum for years, and estimating has always been quite a big part of that, but there's a bit of a movement. Would you call it a movement?
Yeah, a movement, and like not surprisingly, it's called the No Estimates movement, and
Yeah, they took some time coming up with that.
Yeah. The guys, it's interesting actually, because like we brought this up a couple of shows ago, because the Scrum team, one of the Scrum teams I work with, they raised the fact last year that they'd like to stop estimating. They've got their stories down to between 1 and 3 story points. That's and they'd realised that there was estimating was just becoming an overhead for them.
Yeah.
Because they didn't. There wasn't that much difference between the story that's size 1 and the story that's size 3.
Yeah.
You know, it flows through their system pretty fast, and they were focused on flow, which is where this was coming from. You know, they wanted to get things in small chunks and flow it through their system as quickly as possible. So anyway, yeah, it's interesting. There's a guy called Woody Zull who he's been he's quite a humble guy, and he would say, you know, he wasn't the first person to come up with this idea, but he kind of is seen as the person at the forefront of the current Agile No Estimates movement. And the idea is that you focus on decoupling the stories, which is the invest model. You know, you've got the independent stories that are broken down into small chunks of value that you can deliver quickly and flow through a team, and don't focus on estimating, just get it through the system. And this has all started because estimates, we started, I draw that kind of uncertainty so regularly on the board.
Yes.
Where we're saying the closer the kind of uncertainty shows that, the further you are away from completing something, the more variability there is in your estimate. And so break things down into small chunks, a la Kanban, and you have a much better idea of how quickly.
I've got a question about how it works in practice.
Yeah,
sorry to interject, but so I haven't read much about this, admittedly, so I'm really just here to ask questions today.
Yeah.
And my question is, during estimating, the teams normally get to discuss the story a bit more, and things are revealed about maybe previous experience, and the story's fleshed out a bit more. When does that happen if you were to do away with estimating?
So I think there's still an opportunity to discuss the stories before they head into a sprint.
So what point? Can you describe that?
During a backlog refinement meeting.
Right. Okay. And then
just you wouldn't have the estimating part of that, but you still have a discussion.
What would happen during sprint planning?
During sprint planning, they would they'd go through the stories in priority order, and they'd
just
work,
read them out and talk about them,
task them up,
okay.
and then commit to it. And so if they did get a particularly big story, for example, that they weren't comfortable with, they would recognise that through the tasking.
Yes.
They'd see that the number of tasks they were adding would be a great indication of how much effort or complexity there was in that story, and then they could determine what to do with the product owner at that point. And to be honest with you, that's the way our sprint planning sessions have been running more and more recently, as we do it.
Because the estimating, I presume, is fairly quick and agreeable.
Yeah, that's right. And so,
given they're all basically size 2.
Yeah. And sprint planning has been, we've done a lot more estimating during sprint planning, which isn't always the best way to do things, but I think because the team have got this, because the product owner is delivering stories, their stories are in small enough chunks, and the team is able to, the product back to refinement meeting is more of a discussion about acceptance criteria.
So on this particular project you're talking about, you've always had separate sizing meetings, estimating meetings?
Yeah, so
backlog
refinement.
It's slightly different from the way that I've normally done things, because I normally just put it in with sprint planning, because I work on much smaller projects.
Yeah, that's right. But for a new team, for someone who isn't used to Scrum, the sizing can slow things down, and those sprint planning meetings can last for hours. Which they can do.
Yeah, depends. But yeah, sure. So so that means that if you did stop estimating, you would eliminate one meeting per Scrum.
No, I don't think you would.
No, it would be still have the backlog refining meeting.
So is that when you normally do your estimating, during backlog refining?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So it's
and
not a separate meeting for backlog refining.
No, it just happens at
Okay.
the moment that the team has moved towards this approach because we've got a new product owner in the mix, and they're changing things up a bit, and they've got a lot of fresh stories that they want to, or a fresh way of doing things. But we will move back to our refinement meetings. We are going to move back to our refinement meetings.
So what's the case with the new product owner?
Sorry,
Are you having backlog refining meetings with the new product owner?
we will be. Yeah, we will be. We just haven't yet.
You haven't had one yet.
It's only been 2 weeks. So.
Yeah. And so, is this new product owner? Will he be providing the kind of small stories that you're used to, or are you going to have to work on coaching him on breaking down stories?
I think we look fine at the moment. I mean, it's working well. Still, the stories are still of the same size.
Okay.
So so the backlog refinement meeting is still important though, because I still think that it's important that the teams see the stories at least once before they have to sprint plan them.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's interesting because a lot of the time in the backlog refining meeting, we're trying to get stories down to smaller chunks. And I know you had a conversation with this guy who's behind the No Estimating movement, and he said, well, rather than making stories small, aim to make stories, what is it, decoupled, discrete, and
So invest, like
in
you're saying,
chunks of work. Basically.
yeah, and then in turn they'll become small, but don't just try to make them small for the sake of it.
Yeah.
First try to make them discrete, decoupled, and he had a third criteria.
Yeah, that's right. I can't quite remember that one. But the essential thing here is that I see so many people who try and break stories down and deliver no value from the first story. They're essentially delivering a layer or a component kind of approach, and they're not delivering. They don't have a vertical slice of work being delivered, and so we often advocate the use of that story splitting flowchart that is available through Agile for All. Really good flowchart, and it gives you 5 or 6 different ways of splitting stories that still deliver value for that.
Yeah, that's right.
For that, smaller story, that smaller set of stories.
It's a really useful flowchart for people who are having problems splitting up stories, because invariably we go into teams who are new with Scrum, and they almost always seem to feel that's impossible to split up stories, and that's rarely the case. It's difficult, and you have to work with it, but it's rarely impossible. And I see it's decoupled, cohesive, and discrete. So if you work to get your stories like that, they should in turn become smaller.
So this means that stories shouldn't have any dependencies either, because what he's saying here is that they can potentially go in anywhere in the sprint.
Yeah.
And another thing he addresses, because obviously if you choose not to estimate your stories, you're not going to have a velocity. And that's something that
we were talking about this yesterday, actually.
I do agree with this, because I try to impress on our teams that the velocity is for the team and not for the product owners to take away, because sometimes they attach monetary amounts to story points and in terms of velocity, and everybody's really concerned if their velocity drops, and they want to keep seeing their velocity raise. And I think it can be a bit of an impediment having that velocity in there. And the more I impress that it's just for the team, and the longer a team is together and becomes a high performing team, I think they start to disregard the velocity themselves. So I think it becomes a bit of a useless metric, really.
I do. It comes to the point where, because if there is any focus on velocity at all, and we've known this from our own experience, then the team will raise their velocity without doubt. And what they'll do to raise their velocity is increase the sizes of their estimates. For example, that's one way they can game the system. And so,
we just had a comment. Here from John Lowe, former Scrum Master at Boost, actually, who says, "Interesting. As a Scrum Master, I find the team rail against all the meetings." What would you guys say to John? I mean, personally, I'd say maybe you need to look at the meetings and how effective they are, and maybe how interesting they are as well, in order to sort of encourage people.
My advice to John is just to be better.
Which we wouldn't say to everyone, but we know John quite well.
If they're railing against all the meetings, I suppose you have to look at the reasons why, and are they getting value from those meetings? If they get value from those meetings, then hopefully they should see that and stop resisting them.
You have to show them the value, John, and show them, and compare it to the old way of working, which is the alternatives are
having
still
meetings with no outcomes.
No meetings with outcomes
Yeah.
that without outcomes, or meetings
Mm.
that you're not involved in as a team member, and decisions are made for you
Yeah.
based on
True.
someone like a senior developer or a team lead who's
Mhm.
got much more experience, and it's not the reality. They can't work on every single piece of functionality that's being built, and so someone else has to build it. And so you know, whether you want to be, if you're involved in those estimates as a group, at least you get to state what you think is a reality for you, and
Yeah.
not somebody else's reality, you know, and somebody else's ability, you know.
Yeah. So, is there an exercise that we've run to sort of show that? I mean, even just the rope game. The rope game quite simply shows what happens when the team takes responsibility for solving problems, right? As opposed to a project manager. I don't know. It might be useful to run an exercise with your team.
Well, you mentioned a self-organizing team there when you mentioned the rope game. That as well relates to your conversation with Woody about the no estimating, because your team raised that they feel the estimating is an overhead at this time, and
Yeah, that's
they don't really see the value in it. And Woody suggested that if the team feel that it's an overhead, then it is overhead, and something needs to be addressed, because if you don't actually address it, the team is going to feel like they're not being heard, and they just get despondent.
So just, John's made another comment.
Okay.
So John said that, interestingly, we missed one planning meeting and the sprint fell apart, which is not surprising at all. If you didn't have a sprint planning, you don't really have a sprint, do you?
Well, that's great to hear.
But-
I mean, surely
But
the
that is
team...
because that should show the team
Yeah.
that it's essential, right?
There is, I mean, that's following on from what Gav's saying as well. There is some people would approach it, you know, if the team wants to remove one of their meetings, then let them set that up as an experiment,
Yeah.
and then report back on how it worked.
Yeah, let them
You know,
fail.
if they want to take out their retrospectives,
Yeah.
then sure, let's try an experiment where we don't run retrospectives.
Which, of course, we did in a project here, an internal project.
That's right.
And we soon found that the team wanted to tell the product owner things but didn't have a forum to do so.
That's right.
So they brought it back again.
And the problem with having a retrospective, of course, is how do you communicate what's not working for you if it isn't working?
Well,
if you
it
take
happens
the,
in a
if
really
you take-
ad hoc way.
That's
you
right.
know.
If you, so the way that we demonstrate the value of retrospectives, for example, is the ball game. We play the ballpoint game, I think it's sometimes called. But you know, even the paper plane game, it shows the value of all of these meetings. You know,
And interacting and communicating
so
with the product owner.
get them to play the paper plane game. But
Yeah, John. I mean, get in touch if you want a description of the paper plane game and how to run it.
The velocity thing, though, just going back to that, and the fact that obviously management like to know what the velocity is so that they can do a number of things, and be assured that they're getting some value out of this approach. They want to measure the team's productivity in some way.
And sometimes they need to communicate that to other people.
Yeah, that's right. And then the second thing is they want to do
Release
essential
planning.
things like release planning.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
And
When
so-
we were talking yesterday, if all the stories are the same size, then surely your velocity just becomes how many stories you've completed.
that's right. I mean,
So
that
it might
is
be like 10 stories as opposed to 20 points.
yeah.
So there's still a way of having a velocity, it just looks slightly different.
Yeah, and Woody's argument is that what's more important is actually getting the value stream up and running and getting that. This is just going back to the sort of basics of agile fluency, is where you get the team focused on value. You get the people who are feeding the work to the team focused on value,
Yeah.
and then you get the value flowing through your system as quickly as possible and getting delivered to its end point as quickly as possible. And then you can take, the next stage is to look at how you can measure that if you want to measure it, and work out how to, you have to perform at least 2 or 3 sprints before you can get an idea of a team's velocity. And it doesn't usually stabilize until around 5.
Yeah.
And so 5 sprints in, you've then got an ability to measure something. So, even with no estimates, you can still take this approach. No estimates. Make sure the stories are chunked in, like you said, using those kind of criteria that Woody gave earlier, and deliver that value, and then work out how you can measure the team's productivity if you need to measure the team's productivity.
And one thing that Woody said, which I found interesting as well, is that asked the question, has the product owner ever reprioritized a story based on the estimate that was given? And if the answer is no, then what value do the estimates actually have? And if the answer is yes, then that shows that they're really just prioritizing on a cost-based criteria, which is an ideal and I know I've brought this situation up before in past shows, but I'll bring it up again because it's relevant. But I was with a team who had 400 stories, and they wanted to estimate all the stories before they even started any sprints. They had like 2 sprint zeros, and wanted to estimate all those 400 stories because they had to report to somebody and tell them how long they think this is going to take, and they wanted to give a velocity before they started any sprints as well, like sort of an estimated velocity as well, which was a pointless process because we hadn't even started working on any of these. So we're spending a lot of time estimating stories that weren't going to possibly get built, and that we didn't know anything about. So that was one
but
example.
Of course the client would have believed that all of those were necessary and were going to be built.
And it's just one situation where estimating was that the whole point of it was taken out of the team's hands and everything.
Yes.
So I mean, and this looking at, the way that we used to do things was we tried to estimate in ideal days or ideal weeks about how long something would take, or months even, and we used to use a model, an algorithm called the Kokomo, I think it was called, which was this. You broke it down into chunks of work, but they weren't particularly small chunks of work by any, not compared to stories anyway. They were, and you gave them a complexity rating, and then you factored in other things in terms of I can't remember exactly now the Kokomo model, but it's
it's easy for you to say.
Yeah, that's right. It's easy for me to say. But essentially, you were just doing. You were creating this kind of precise number at the end of it, which was like all based on these values that you plucked out of the air to start with.
Yeah.
It's a constructive cost model.
And we were, that's right. And we were using this in terms of like building new software. This is the thing we keep saying over and over again. If you're building the same thing that you built last year, then you've got a very good idea of how to build it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that all of this evidence-based kind of approach to estimating in software would work if we were building the same thing that we built last year, but we don't build the same things. We build new and innovative technology
every time,
and we use new and interesting technologies in ways that we're trying to make a point of difference, so that we can, i.e. either improve our business process or make a point of difference that we can sell and capitalize on. And so software just doesn't work well with evidence-based rule of thumb type approaches, and so we've moved to story points, and we've got much more of the relative story sizing, and we're looking at complexity and uncertainty and all of those kind of things and unknowns, and we're just saying gut instinct relative to other stories, and now to me that kind of just goes one step further with the no estimates, which is the story sizing and the story approach has created a small piece of index card size piece of work, and so now moving to no estimates just seems like not that much of an extra leap to me.
My own personal feeling about this whole movement is that estimating is really, really useful
to evoke a conversation,
and it's a useful tool to get that happening, especially with new teams or teams that are new to Scrum.
That's right.
Teams that haven't really worked together. I think it's a very useful tool for that. And I think to throw a team in without estimating might be problematic if they are new to the project, or
absolutely.
But I think a team could very easily evolve, which has happened with your team, evolve into that whole no estimating thing. I'd be interested to see how a project would work if you just took estimating out of it from the outset.
That's right. I agree with you, and I think I still kind of feel like that approach, the user story approach, and the estimating and Scrum as a framework is it's an agile implementation, like a set of training wheels. And once you understand the agile principles and you are an agile, you're living the agile values and principles, then I think you can start to look at whether the team the team can decide whether they need to take some of these things off. You just need to check in with the team whether they actually understand what the values and principles are that we're and what might happen if we stopped doing something like estimating or holding retrospective meetings or having daily stand-ups.
And I suppose that leaves just one issue or problem, whatever word you want to use, about no estimating, if you choose to go down that path, is that it's a hard sell to management or to, in our case, clients, because
That's right.
they never. It's very hard for them to do their release planning and to really get their heads around. It's a total mind
But
shift.
you know, if you were to talk to them about counting stories instead of
Yeah.
as velocity rather than actual story points, I think that's basically the same thing. If all stories are the same size.
Yeah, but again, it's just having that buy-in from the top, I suppose, which is always really, really important. And I think you really need a lot of trust there.
You
Yeah,
know, on
to
a
be honest
mature
with-
team that's moving to this, obviously you have an established relationship with the product
That's right.
owner.
Yeah.
Hopefully, unless they're new, which is probably a little more tricky. But you know, it is a high trust relationship already,
Yeah.
and that's part of the reason why it's a mature team that's going to be thinking about this, right?
And I mean, I think that's going to be. I agree with you totally. It should be a mature team who's looking at this, 'cause these are mature teams that are moving to this no estimates approach. And it, you know, because it teaches estimates teach a couple of things, i.e., they, you know, and the focus is on delivering value and breaking stories into kind of using the invest model and so on. And I think those are really good approaches to go through at the beginning of this. And you know, we say this again and again, that Scrum feels like the training wheels, and that approach is, you know, it's a set of training wheels. I think the maturity thing is, and there's a number of ways of looking at it, and some people call it agile fluency. And I think, you know, it's interesting that the team here that are discussing the no estimates approach are 3 years in to this project. You know, they know each other well, and they know their product owners well, even though one of them has changed. That product, that, you know, it's still.
Well, actually, I mean, the team members have changed as well.
Yeah.
You know, not all of them. Certainly, 2 of them haven't been on it for 3 years. But because it's such a well-established team, bringing them in and getting them on board was a lot faster
Yeah,
than it would have been with a new team. You know.
That's right. It's a classic example of a value stream of work that has remained really effective, because even though, like you say, the team has probably completely changed since then.
Yeah, it's completely different from how it started. Right?
Yeah, but the way that we integrate team members and the way that the team integrate their team members when new team members has worked really well.
I mean, it's practically seamless.
Yeah.
It's just that first couple of weeks and then they're away, right?
Yeah.
So if anybody has any comments or anything about no estimating,
No estimates, yeah.
could give us a shout.
We're talking to you, John.
And it kind of segues nicely into mob programming, because we're talking about the team, and the team, you know, the mob programming approach. The great analogy that I've heard about this is it's like an ER or an emergency room, when, you know, if you've got something fairly minor happening, you're sitting in the emergency room for hours on end waiting for a doctor to see you. And you know, but as soon as someone comes in that is an absolute emergency, and they have to, you know, deal with them straight away, you suddenly get a very reasonably large group of people gathering around. Several doctors, several senior, you know, medical staff will be there discussing approaches, and you know, and you know, having that conversation backwards and forwards about what the best approaches would be to get this person as stable as possible, as quickly as possible. And so and that's kind of, it's quite a neat analogy to mob programming, except, you know, mob programming is the next level on from pair programming, if you like, where mob programming is where you have the whole team involved in solving a problem, or you know.
But hopefully with a little less urgency than an emergency room.
Yeah.
So mob programming is basically when you have an entire team around one computer, and you have one person doing
They're facilitating the team, if you like. That's what they call it. So they're the person who's typing in the code or whatever they're doing, and you have the whole team. So this is a cross-functional team that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So it would be BAs, UX, testers, and developers all sitting there. If that's what
Whoever the team's made up
if
of.
that's what your team's made up of, you know, and they all take turns. They're working in a gang, and they're making comments on.
This is just going back slightly to estimating. John has made a comment saying our biggest problem with estimating has been in underestimating. We use a 1, 2, 3, 5 system. A 5-point story once became a 20-point story over 4 sprints.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe you need some more cards there for a start.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Take it up to 13.
And stories, I mean, do inflate. You get stories that do obviously become a lot bigger, and you need to re-estimate them. But I wonder, it'd be
If it's sort
interesting.
of the 4 sprints, though, wouldn't you be more tempted to break that story down into several stories? So,
Yeah,
so you
I
can
mean,
finish one and then move on to the next.
I think that would certainly be a good idea. And I'd be interested to know why, if people felt, you're saying you're working on a 1, 2, 3, and 5 system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you know.
Also, he says getting some people to pipe up when they think a story is underestimated.
Yeah.
So maybe some work needs to happen on helping members of the team to contribute during meetings.
Yeah.
You know, not everyone feels the same confidence, but there's certainly ways of establishing safe
And
places
I think
to
as
speak,
a
you know.
scrum master in stand-ups as well, you're going to notice if a story is, you know, if there's not a lot of progress being made in the story, so that might be a good time to ask the team, hey,
Should we revisit?
what's the situation
Yeah.
here? And yeah.
They
Yeah.
have to recalibrate essentially, John, because obviously they're 5. I mean, a story has to be 1/3 or 1/2 of your sprint duration maximum, and you need to get 2 or 3 stories into your sprint at least. And if they've only got 5 as their maximum, then they obviously, what we would be saying, if they hit a 5, if that was their maximum number, they could assign a story. If they hit a 5, I would be asking them to say, well, a 5's too big to fit into your sprint.
Yeah.
How are we
Can
going
be
to break this
broken
story
down.
down?
Yeah.
Because we need
Because
to.
your scale's so small.
That's
yeah.
right. So you need to either add another number, like a 8 or a 13 at least, or maybe a
Yeah.
20,
Mm.
or you need to get the team to start breaking stories down as soon as they
Their
hit the
5s.
5.
Yeah.
Because their 5
Yeah,
essentially
so-
is their extra large story, and that means it shouldn't be in their sprint.
Because of your scale.
It does sound like just a very basic thing of putting in, like you say, an 8 and a 13 in there would at least give the team members the flexibility to say, whoa, this actually feels like a monster, so I'm going to put down a 13.
Yeah, I mean, but you could still just work with 5 being the largest, because even if you add an 8 or a 13, you're still not going to need to remember that an 8 and a 13 need to
Needs to
be
be
broken
broken
down.
That's right,
down.
yeah.
I think that's the major point to remember,
Yeah.
that the largest story needs to be broken down,
Yeah.
particularly given your recent experience of the
Yeah.
story extending over 4 sprints. So I hope that helps.
Yep. So mod programming, that's
Again,
what it is, and it's interesting because that's another.
So this extends the ideas of pair programming.
Yes.
It takes them even further to involve the entire team in actually building the product. And the thing that the proponents of this sort of state is that you will get software delivered faster and of a much higher quality than you would have done using just a single programmer or a pair programmer, because you've got the entire team who are responsible for delivering that software present and able to comment. So the testers will be making comments. They might even take over the keyboard. One of the testers might even start testing the software as you go, you know, or so on. So you're just, there's lots of ping pong going on with the keyboard. They actually talk about pair programming, you know, ping ponging, in the sense that a developer writes a test, they pass the keyboard over to the other developer, who then writes the code that fulfills that test, and then they write a test, and then they pass it back to the other developer to write the code that fulfills that test, and so on.
I'm looking for potential problems with this approach, being a naturally sceptical person. Could it be too many people on a problem though? Too many sort of opposing views? Or is it your opinion that you can never have too many views when you're approaching a problem?
I think each developer, for example, knowing developers quite well, they will all have different ways of doing things.
Yeah.
But these guys are a Scrum team, and they need to be able to work on things as a group, and they need to, you know, so they will have an agreed way of working, and as they get to know each other, they will know each other's.
I don't know, but given that a Scrum team is 5 to 9 people, you could potentially have 9 people talking about this problem. I can see that sort of taking longer to resolve than if it were 3 people.
I've never seen mob programming in practice.
There is a great video actually that we should tweet out or
we'll stick on the
put it on our
description,
because it shows it's a 4-minute elapsed time video of 8 hours of mob programming. But it gives you a really good idea of what the vibe is like in terms of like the amount of interaction and so on. My argument would be, and I think this is the argument for mob programming, is that those discussions will happen, and that they'll happen. That there'll be a much longer feedback loop happening though as a result of the if you check some work in and another developer spots a problem with it, or the tester spots a problem with it down the line, then you've got a lot longer time for that feedback to get back to you and for changes to be made effective. So it's about shortening those feedback loops as much as possible.
It'd be interesting to see it in practice.
Yeah. Okay, and that's all we have time for today.
That's right.
We are going to try with the board to limit our topics to one, possibly two per week. We just feel it will help focus things a little bit. So
Yeah.
if anybody has any topics that they'd like to see us talk about, feel free to send them in to info@boost.co.nz. We'd really love to get some topics brought up by people outside of just us. And otherwise, we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks. Thank you.
See you.